Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Pensive Politics with Mr. Watson. I am most certainly your host, Christian Watson. It is phenomenal to be with you, to be in your living room, to be with you on your commute, on your exercise routine, wherever my voice is right now, transmitting to you through this internet, through time and space, through this divine sort of portal of human ingenuity. Thank you for allowing me to have that privilege. I just appreciate it so much. We've got a lot of news to cover today, guys. President Trump and the Democrats are getting into a spat over the sort of necromantic names that so many bases, military bases, have. These necromantic names, of course, are names that the old Confederacy had. So Fort Robert E. Lee, Fort Briggs, all this kind of stuff. The president is stalwart in his resolve to defend these institutions and to make sure that they remain unchanged, they remain static, so to speak. The Democratic Party wants to get rid of them because they believe that they represent some sort of form of racism or what have you. We're talking about that. The North Dakota Indians, particularly a representative over North Dakota, is leading the charge against the president having not only a light show at Mount Rushmore, but also he is offering, and these are his words, to deface Mount Rushmore for little to no money, in his words, of course, because it is a blotch, I'm paraphrasing now, on the Native Americans' land. So we'll talk about that entire concept and why I think that both sides are a little bit misguided with this. And ultimately, guys, we're going to have a little conversation about tradition. We're going to have a little, because tradition is one of those things that a lot of us just, again, it's active. It's active, not passive, so to speak. It's one of those things that we just adhere to because it seems good, it looks good. But I'm going to give you a tool and a key as to how to adhere to tradition properly and to how to make sure that the tradition that you adhere to is not being adhered to by you, is not being given your energy solely because it is traditional. Without further ado, let's get into this, guys. So, the Democrats and the president, I shouldn't say the Democrats, the Democrat leadership in the Senate and the president of the United States, President Trump, have gotten to a spat. Once again, this is not new. I mean, the guy literally at the beginning of his administration had Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer go into the same room, and he held some sort of, some public jousting, some public gladiators ring, I don't know. But all of them were just taking shots at each other while they were in the Oval Office. And it was good media coverage. It was good for media, but I think it was terrible for the morale of the institutions that this country is using to survive right now. So they are having a spat right now because the president is determined to not sign away, in his words, the history of this country, i.e. the Confederate bases. And so the Democrats are opposing a new NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is if you guys don't know, is an annual bill that funds the military and defense-related stuff. And, of course, every year, the NDAA has some sort of proviso in it that causes people to get angry, whether it's financing some new weapon that the United States really doesn't need to kill people across the globe, or it's indefinitely ensuring the indefinite detention of Americans, as an NDAA 2012 did, which caught the chagrin of people like Rand Paul and people like Mike Lee back then. I mean, whatever it is, that bill is cursed. That even though it is basically an appropriations bill for the military, that bill is cursed. It is fundamentally cursed. I don't understand why almost every single year, even though it is a blanket military appropriations bill, folks have some gripe, some axe to grind with it. It's cursed. It is damned. And it's seeping up from that realm of damnation in which it is bound, and it's infecting all of us, so to speak. And so the Democrats have, in true politician fashion, they have inserted a proviso in the bill which would rename the old Confederate bases like Fort Robert E. Lee and so on and so forth into something else. It would just get rid of those names. It would, in a sense, erase the history of the Confederacy from the institution of the United States, or would have been known back then as the Union military. And so the president says this is not going to happen. You're erasing our history, attacking our history. It's not going to happen. I'm going to give you guys a little secret. I'm not entirely sure President Trump has a solid conviction on this. I think President Trump sees this as history just being taken away, and he's against that, and that's a valid position. I'm not attacking that. But he doesn't really have a conviction on this. He doesn't really have a solid ground to stand on this. The Democrats, on the other hand, I'm not entirely sure if this was 10, 15 years ago, if they would have really stood strong on the ground that Confederate statues and Confederate memorials and Confederate bases were an abysmal reminder of white supremacy and all kind of dictatorial, brutish, dark chaos inflicted upon the American experiment by a bunch of radicals who had no regard for the founders, who had no regard for their principles, who had no regard for that universal special principle of individuality and equality, which is bound up and embedded into the DNA of every American, who had no regard, had zero regard for that individual freedom, which animates our essences. The Confederacy had no regard for any of that stuff. None. And so the argument goes, if they had no regard for that, then why emblazon the names of people who fought for that lack of disregard onto a military which supposedly has that kind of regard? That is a great question. And the answer to that question is most unfortunate. The answer to that question is because a lot of folks and a lot of institutions in America have a blind adherence to tradition. It's very simple. Now, this is an issue in which I am largely indifferent. I am not entirely sure that I don't believe in time. I don't think time goes both ways. I think time is a linear construct. It's a linear principle. Time is not a construct. It is a linear principle. That's what time is. And so I'm not necessarily sure that a Confederate base being on the United States military's sort of payroll, being in the United States military protection, has the same significance as a Confederate base in the possession of a Confederate army. But regardless, it's not good aesthetics. It's not good optics. But I'm not entirely sure what the moral harm, the moral ill is by those names simply existing on the bases which are used to propagate actions which fundamentally debunk and invert every single thing the Confederate States of American Army put out into the world. So if you have their name, look, watch this. This is brilliant. If you have a Confederate name on a base which is being used to counter everything the Confederacy did throughout history in a way by embodying the freedom they refused to embody, are you really having an ill there or a harm there by having the name there? Or is the name being harmed and is the name being diluted from what it truly was? And if that is the goal in the first place, it appears the Democrats' goal is to ensure that these names have no place on United States institutional hallmarks. If that's the case, then why not continue to silently watch this degrade those names by the just actions of a virtuous military? Unfortunately, our military is not always virtuous. Not their fault. It's our politicians' fault. Politicians want to fight endless wars, and they want to police people, they want to bomb people into oblivion. But the ideas upon which the United States military is predicated upon are quite virtuous. They are fundamentally virtuous, my friends. The ideas of fighting for freedom, ensuring that this homeland of freedom and individuality is secured against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that is a virtuous idea. So, I don't understand what the manifest harm is. If any of you are against Confederate names on bases, which again, I am ambivalent, I am leaning to being towards against them, but I'm just trying to figure out where is the manifest harm if our actions are against and are going against continuously the principles in which the Confederacy espoused. That's my question. This is not to say that we should keep people who clearly were against those principles on our hallmarks or whatever. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying there is a sort of silent erosion of the significance of the terror behind those Confederate names that is being proselytized and is being trailblazed by the United States military. So I don't quite understand the manifest harm of these bases being there. I don't understand that. But I also don't understand why some folks have this tendency to say, if you want to get rid of a name on a building, you are erasing history. Consider that argument logically for a moment. Let's do a syllogism here. Let's do an Aristotelian syllogism here. Because syllogisms are the science of reason. Syllogisms are the science of reason. Let's do an Aristotelian syllogism here. And syllogisms are basically how Aristotle and how the ancient logicians argued, and how modern logicians also argue. It's one of the basic forms of an argument, syllogism. So let's start with the premise A. Premise A. The Confederacy was an immoral, abominable force. Premise B. The Confederacy utilized certain institutional tools to propagate their immorality and their violence. Premise C. The conclusion, not premise C, but conclusion C. The conclusion. Therefore, every institution that is associated with the Confederacy, even loosely, must be a reminder and therefore a propagation of that violence and immorality. That would be a basic syllogism by which people who are against the Confederate names on these buildings would use to analyze this and say, hey, this argument makes sense, let's get rid of them. Here's the problem with that line of thinking. Number one, the premise A is certainly true. The Confederacy was an immoral and violent force. That's certainly true. That's 100% true. I will not disagree with that. It's 100% true. The premise B is where we get into problems. Premise B is where we get into problems. Premise B essentially is saying that simply by proximity, not by action, by proximity, the Confederacy is continuously living throughout history, and therefore, being that reminder is still harming people, and that leads to the conclusion that they must be removed, or else those harms will continue. But actions and justices don't happen passively. They don't happen simply by osmosis or circumstance. Injustices happen vis-a-vis action. Injustices happen via actual intent to do injustice, or actual actions which, intended or not, cause injustice. You can measure an injustice objectively. You can measure one objectively. You cannot objectively measure or deduce from that syllogism, from that science of human reason, from that example I just gave you, an injustice that exists purely because there is a name attached to a building. It's a reminder indeed, but there's very little difference between that reminder and the reminder of something else which has a Confederate name attached to it. I'm sure the Battle of Gettysburg is a reminder of a bloody conflict that happened, and one of the more bloodier and terrible, baleful conflicts of the entire war. Does that mean that we have to try to do something to sanitize it? No. History is both a beautiful and an ugly thing. However, I also don't think that you erase history by getting rid of a single statue or getting rid of a single namesake. History is a record. History transcends. We are living in history right now. We are creating history. I am creating history. History is rolling off the tip of my tongue right now and is going towards you, and it is implanting itself into your body, and it is germinating in your mind, and it is producing revelation. I am creating history right now. I'm engaged in the divine alchemy of history right now, and it's going towards you right now, my brothers and sisters. I am making history right now. I am history. You are history. History is continuous. You cannot erase history. To erase history would be to erase life, to erase memory, permanently, universally. You can get your memory mistaken, you can alter memory, but you cannot erase these things universally. You cannot erase life universally. These things are constants. Certain things in the universe are axiomatic constants. So no, you're not erasing history if you get rid of a Confederate namesake. That's not what's happening. What's happening is you are insinuating that particular piece of history is consistently and utterly violent or harmful towards the memory of people, or towards people in this modern era. And that's a wrong view to take for the reason that I outlined a few moments ago. So there's a middle ground on this. I can want to preserve history and not tie history and historical significance to a single material object. And I can also not want hallmarks of dictatorial madness and rebellious rage to be appended to the Union which stood for freedom. They can coexist, guys. The question that we have right now, the task we have right now to getting them to coexist, is to quite simply try to gauge a little bit of introspection. Understand why our hearts are in our positions and why our positions are in our hearts. And then with that understanding, with that introspection, go forth toward your ideological opponents. If you're a person who wants statues to stay, people who don't want statues to stay, vice versa, and talk. Don't make this about white supremacy or racism or some ill that is pretty morally egregious and you can universally condemn it, because then you have no conversation. Make this about what is actually driving these people. A vast majority of people on either side are not driven by revisionism, i.e. people who want to get rid of the statues, or white supremacy, people who want to keep them. Most people who are in this discussion are driven by good faith. So that's where I stand on it. And personally, I'm leaning more towards to get rid of them at least on public property, not public property, yes, oxymoron, on government-affiliated institutions. If you are a private institution, this goes without saying, you should be able to do whatever the heck you want to do. If you want to have a memoriam to Robert E. Lee or to Nathan Meadow Forest on your private property, you go right ahead. And it is the police's duty to protect you at all costs. And it is the police's duty to arrest the rioters who try to destroy that at all costs. But if you're a government institution, you probably shouldn't be honoring the fallen side, the baleful side, the evil side. You should really reconsider your morals. But vice versa, you also shouldn't call everyone who wants to keep those statues up racist or white supremacists, because most of them are not. They simply aren't. But speaking of racism and white supremacy, let's talk about what's happening in North Dakota right now. And we're going to cut this episode short because there's so much going on, and I want to be able to give everything as much time as possible in the next episode. But I'm trying to make sure that I can at least give you guys a preview for what's coming next. So, President Trump wants to have a fireworks show above Mount Rushmore, 4th of July. Which, again, is a pretty quintessential thing to do. I mean, Mount Rushmore is a representation of American presidents. It is a representation of the minds that led America throughout history. But a lot of people, especially a lot of people amongst the Sioux, and a lot of the Indian tribes in North Dakota, are simply saying, well, this is not right. It's not right because this is our land. This was our land. In fact, the fact that you think that you have the right to come in here and do a demonstration of your national pride, this is how the Indians are thinking. This is how none of the Indians, the Native Americans, this is how the Native Americans, excuse me. This is how the Native Americans are thinking. Excuse me, didn't mean to be offensive if that was offensive at all. Although, this is how the Native Americans were thinking. And therefore you shouldn't be able to do it. So here's my problem with this. It's very odd. Native Americans, especially a lot of, and this varies across tribes, but this is general constant. Most of them do not believe in property ownership. So it's very curious to me that the spokesman of a very influential tribe is saying, well, property ownership is important to us. Property ownership is indispensable to us in our land. Our people. Our property is being scarred and blotched by the president's attempt to show national pride. Therefore, we must act against it. But a lot of times, even during when we embarked on very baleful and terrible acquisitions of land that tribes occupied, which were terrible, by the way, terrible, and nothing justifies it. Even when we had done that, a lot of tribes had written to the colonists who had tried to beckon with them that this land, you can't own the land, that's foreign. The earth is their mother, you cannot own their mother, that's foreign to them. So in a sense, it's very interesting to see how years upon years upon years of Native American tradition has reversed itself. Again, this varies from tribe to tribe, but this is pretty universal throughout all. It's reversed itself in the phase of political expediency. I'm not saying that the president should do a fireworks show above Mount Rushmore. I mean, there are people who are fire marshals who have much more expertise in that than I do. I'm not saying that at all. I am making no value judgment about that. But I do think it's interesting how throughout time, certain tribal or institutional constants that are held as truths by a certain people, or a certain kind of people, or a certain affiliated kind of people, is now seen as transient and disposable in the face of political expediency. If there's any problem in American politics, fundamentally, there's a values problem, folks. There's a values problem. a lot of Americans, and I'm gonna close in a few minutes here. A lot of Americans aren't really concerned about having core convictions and fighting to the death. There are a contingent who are. And that is the contingent that marched very, very bravely in the face of these COVID protests. The contingent that is willing to don their weapons and secure the private property against riotous individuals. There is a contingent of Americans, even Americans who are willing to stand up against police brutality, who are willing to say, okay, qualified immunity needs to be reformed. We need to do these things. There is a contingent of American minds that most certainly have conviction. A majority of people, however, do not have conviction. And so, this is the problem with opportunists in politics. When you get someone who doesn't have conviction, they will enter into a political space with the motivations, watch me, the motivations of someone who wants power and not someone who wants truth. I think a lot of Native American tribes who have been opposing fracking, they have valid reasons, don't get me wrong, but they are reforming thousands of years of doctrine on their part simply for political expediency, because they feel aggrieved, they feel threatened. They're going to take the tools of the modern era and they're going to utilize them to their advantage. Whether you say that's wrong or right, it's just an observation, in my opinion. It's an observation. But this feeds back into tradition. Tradition is just, it can bind the mind or it can liberate the soul. If you got a strong tradition of freedom and honesty binding yourself, then guess what? Your soul's liberated. But if you got a registered tradition of deceit, of corruption, of chaos, or a blind adherence to certain customs, then you could stunt your human growth. And so if I can leave with anything, let me leave with this. Never allow a pre-established or preordained way of doing something dictate how you live the future. Only allow those things to guide you if you find those things have objective value for your growth as a human being and the cultivation of your boundless human potential, which is conceived through the incubator tube of freedom. That's it. That's it. And you guys can guess what that means. So, until next time, guys, I appreciate you saying this for this very short episode of Pensive Politics, the very abbreviated episode of Pensive Politics. And until then, guys, please stay pensive.